During the sweltering months of 1944, Wehrmacht soldiers stationed across Normandy discovered a terror descending from above that would haunt their nightmares for decades to come. One German foot soldier recorded in his journal the absolute dread that arrived from the clouded Norman heavens. His company had been advancing to strengthen coastal fortifications, trudging along a cramped pathway bordered by the famous bocage hedgerows that transformed the terrain into a deadly maze. Morning fog blanketed everything, the type of conditions that typically kept warplanes grounded. Except these warplanes didn't care about weather. The Thunderbolts emerged through the gray curtain with zero advance notice. No opportunity to disperse, no chance for shelter, no reaction time whatsoever except hurling yourself into the closest drainage ditch and praying to every saint you remembered. Engine thunder, chattering guns. His entire world transformed into flames and bedlam. Veterans of these raids spoke about their experiences using language that revealed psychological wounds. Plenty had confronted Soviet armor at Kursk, survived bombardments that converted landscapes into lunar craters, witnessed comrades perish in manners they could never share with loved ones waiting at home. Yet nothing across 4 brutal years of history's most savage warfare had equipped them for what the Americans designated the P-47 Thunderbolt. What transpired during those horrifying moments would persuade thousands of enemy troops that the Western campaign was finished. The leading aircraft flipped inverted, plunged into a screaming dive, and the terrain below erupted into devastation and cacophony and obliteration. That enormous radial power plant cowling appeared to consume the entire horizon as it descended. Those elliptical wings bristling with ordnance. Every Wehrmacht soldier in France recognized them instantly. They nicknamed them Jabos, shortened from Jagdbomber, meaning fighter-bomber. But this specific Jabo carried another designation that would become interchangeable with absolute fear. The peculiar aspect? Nobody anticipated the Thunderbolt evolving into an instrument of terror. When Luftwaffe aviators initially encountered it above Western Europe during April 1943, their reaction was laughter. German fighter pilots observed the American formations approaching at 25,000 feet and transmitted to their wingmen with poorly disguised mockery. The Americans, they declared, were piloting barrels through the sky. That joke would rapidly turn to bitter ashes. Compared against the streamlined Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the lethally nimble Focke-Wulf FW-190, the P-47 appeared ridiculous. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds without payload, practically double the mass of competing single-engine fighters. Its fuselage was so broad and thick that aviators joked it resembled a milk container, spawning its nickname, the Jug. German pilots started calling it the Razorback due to the angular profile of its original canopy design. American flyers themselves questioned what headquarters was thinking, strapping them into a beast that seemed engineered by bureaucratic compromise rather than aviation genius. The ridicule appeared justified initially. During early dogfights, the Thunderbolt's performance looked mediocre at absolute best. It couldn't match turns with agile German interceptors. Its climb rate was unimpressive. It appeared too bulky, too massive, too awkward to survive in the merciless Darwinian arena of aerial warfare, where velocity and maneuverability separated survivors from casualties. The man who conceived this seeming aberration was Alexander Kartveli, born Alexander Kartvelishvili in Tbilisi, Georgia, in 1896. He'd departed Georgia in 1919 on a government scholarship to pursue aeronautical engineering at the prestigious École supérieure d'aéronautique in Paris. When Soviet armies occupied his homeland in 1921, returning became impossible. He journeyed first to France, then America, eventually landing at Republic Aviation Corporation on Long Island, New York. Kartveli was a brilliant engineer who grasped something his detractors missed entirely. He wasn't constructing a dogfighter to outturn enemy aircraft in graceful aerial waltz. He was forging a weapon of industrial warfare engineered to absorb punishment that would annihilate any competing aircraft and deliver its pilot home safely. Where rival designers pursued elegance and agility, Kartveli chose raw power and durability. Where others sought grace, Kartveli engineered survival. Kartveli built his design around the colossal Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial representing the most powerful aircraft engine available, generating over 2,000 horsepower. The engine alone tipped scales at 2,500 pounds. To make that power plant perform at high altitude, where American heavy bombers would require escort protection, he installed an innovative turbo supercharger system in the rear fuselage, connected through complex ducting running the aircraft's entire length. The configuration added substantial weight and complexity, but it granted the Thunderbolt extraordinary performance above 20,000 feet, where competing fighters gasped for oxygen. Then Kartveli armed it with firepower that bordered on excessive. 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds of ammunition. When all 8 weapons fired simultaneously, they could deliver 100 rounds per second into a target zone 6 feet across. One 3-second burst could sever a German fighter completely, or reduce a transport truck to flaming wreckage. No other fighter worldwide carried such devastating armament. When Kartveli presented his design to skeptics questioning whether such a massive aircraft could function as a fighter, he reportedly smiled and stated it would be a dinosaur. But it would be a dinosaur with excellent proportions. The prototype, designated XP-47B, first flew on May 6, 1941, piloted by Republic test pilot Lowry Brabham. Despite an engine fire during flight forcing an emergency landing, Brabham declared they'd hit the jackpot. The aircraft handled beautifully despite its dimensions, and its dive speed was absolutely spectacular. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England during January 1943 with the 56th Fighter Group, eventually nicknamed Zemke's Wolf Pack after their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke. Pilots transferring from nimble Spitfires were unimpressed. The Thunderbolt lost so consistently against the British fighter in practice combat that commanders eventually prohibited the exercises entirely. It was demolishing pilot confidence and squadron morale. Some aviators openly questioned whether they'd received a death sentence rather than a fighting machine. The fundamental problem? Everyone was approaching the aircraft incorrectly. They were attempting to make it fight like a Spitfire, turning and twisting in classical aerial combat. The P-47 wasn't designed for that methodology. It was engineered for something else entirely, something requiring months of trial and error to discover. Zemke understood this reality. He was a methodical leader who'd served as a military observer with the Royal Air Force in 1940, witnessing the Battle of Britain unfold from British airfields. He'd observed what German tactics could accomplish against pilots who failed to adapt. He'd watched squadrons of courageous young men climb into their Hurricanes and Spitfires, never to return, because they fought how tradition demanded, rather than how survival required. Now, he developed tactics specifically engineered to exploit the Thunderbolt's unique advantages, its devastating dive speed exceeding 450 milliseconds, and its ability to absorb damage that would obliterate any competing fighter. The methodology was straightforward. Maintain altitude. Avoid turning engagements. Utilize the Thunderbolt's superior performance above 20,000 feet to secure altitude advantage over German fighters. Then dive on them from above with tremendous velocity. Fire a burst with those 8 machine guns and zoom back to altitude before the enemy could respond. Hit and run. Boom and zoom. Never permit the Germans to dictate combat terms. If they turned, don't follow. Climb back and establish another diving attack. On April 8, 1943, the Thunderbolt flew its maiden combat mission, a fighter sweep over the French coast. Results were unspectacular. Radio malfunctions forced an abort before any enemy contact. It appeared to confirm what critics believed. The P-47 was too large, too heavy, too complicated to succeed in combat. Pilots returned to base, frustrated and demoralized. Then something changed that would transform the air war over Europe. Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson was 23 years old when he arrived in England with the 56th Fighter Group. He was a farm kid from Lawton, Oklahoma, who dreamed of flying since watching an Army Air Corps demonstration team perform when he was 8 years old. His father had taken him to an air show at Post Field, and young Bob sat on his father's shoulders, watching biplanes perform aerobatics in the Oklahoma sky. From that instant, he knew flying was his destiny. Nothing else would suffice. Johnson worked at a cabinet shop for $4 weekly to fund flying lessons, logging 35 hours by his 16th birthday. He enrolled in the civilian pilot training program while attending Cameron Junior College, and when war arrived, he enlisted immediately. But his path to becoming one of history's greatest fighter aces wasn't smooth. He was initially trained as a bomber pilot and had to request transfer to fighters. His gunnery scores in training were so poor, achieving only 4.5% accuracy against towed targets when 5% was minimum requirement, that he technically should never have been cleared for combat. But the Army needed pilots, and Johnson was determined. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was flying escort for B-17 bombers returning from a raid on targets in northern France when his flight was ambushed by Focke-Wulf Ungainly from Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the most veteran German fighter units in the West. The Germans emerged from the sun exactly as doctrine prescribed, invisible until the final moment. Within seconds, Johnson's P-47 was shot to pieces. 21 20mm cannon shells tore through his aircraft. The explosive rounds ripped holes in his fuselage, shattered his canopy, sent shrapnel into his face and leg. Fire erupted in the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across what remained of his windscreen. His controls went mushy, barely responsive. The engine began trailing smoke. Blood ran down his face from shrapnel wounds. Johnson attempted to bail out, but the damaged canopy wouldn't open. He pushed. He pulled. He hammered it with his fists until his hands were bloody. Nothing worked. He was trapped in a burning, crippled aircraft 20,000 feet above enemy territory with no escape route and no hope of rescue. Then a lone FW-190 appeared alongside. The German pilot, whose identity remains unknown today, had exhausted his cannon ammunition in the initial attack. But he wasn't finished. He began methodically pumping machine gun rounds into Johnson's aircraft, making pass after pass after pass, determined to complete what he'd started. Johnson huddled behind the inch-thick armor plate behind his seat and watched tracers flash past. He could do nothing. His controls were barely responsive. His engine was dying. His guns were out of ammunition. By every measure, by every rule of aerial warfare, he should have been dead. The laws of physics and the mathematics of war said he couldn't survive. The German pilot made 3 more passes. Each time his bullets slammed into the P-47. Each time Johnson felt impacts shudder through his airframe. Each time the Thunderbolt kept flying. The big radial engine coughed and sputtered, but refused to quit. The controls responded just enough to maintain level flight. Finally, the German pilot pulled alongside one final time. Johnson could see him clearly through the shattered canopy, just a few dozen feet away. The Luftwaffe pilot was shaking his head in what appeared to be disbelief. He looked at the wreckage of an aircraft that was somehow still airborne, an aircraft that should have been scattered in pieces across the French countryside, and he seemed unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. How was this possible? Survival sometimes defies every rule written in blood. The German rocked his wings in salute and turned away. He'd run out of ammunition. He'd done everything correctly, hit his target with cannon and machine gun fire until he had nothing left to shoot. And still, the American aircraft flew on. Johnson nursed his shattered Thunderbolt back across the English Channel. Every minute he expected the engine to seize, the controls to fail, the aircraft to disintegrate around him. But the big jug kept flying. When he finally landed at the emergency field at Manston on the Kent coast, ground crew gathered around in stunned silence. They counted over 200 bullet holes in his aircraft. 20 mimetised cannon rounds had torn through engine cowling, fuselage, wings, tail. Machine gun bullets had shredded control surfaces and punched through skin in dozens of places. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The electrical system was wrecked. The propeller was damaged. The cockpit was scorched from fire. Several cylinders had been shot off the engine. The P-47 was a complete write-off. It would never fly again. But Bob Johnson walked away with wounds that would heal. He would later state he owed his life to Alexander Kartveli's dinosaur, to the Georgian immigrant who'd built an aircraft so tough it could absorb everything the Luftwaffe could throw at it and keep flying. German ace Heinz Baer, who would finish the war with 220 victories, later stated that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Other German pilots shared similar accounts. Pilots returned with cylinders shot off their engines. They came back with control surfaces shredded by cannon fire. They landed with holes in their wings large enough to crawl through. One pilot returned with 5 feet of his wingtip missing after colliding with a telephone pole during a strafing run. The air-cooled radial engine kept running even when damaged in ways that would have destroyed the liquid-cooled engines of other fighters. A single bullet through a coolant line would bring down a Messerschmitt or a Mustang. The Thunderbolt just kept going. Johnson returned to combat after recovering from his wounds and became one of the greatest aces in the European theater. By the time he finished his tour in May 1944, he'd shot down 27 German aircraft, all in P-47s, becoming the first American pilot to surpass legendary Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. He flew 91 combat missions without ever losing faith in the aircraft that had saved his life over France. But the Thunderbolt's true transformation, the change that would make it feared by every German soldier in Europe, was yet to come. The aircraft, that had proven itself in aerial combat, was about to discover an entirely new mission, one that would make it the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. In March 1944, Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group approached his commanders with an unusual and dangerous request. Duncan was a Texan from the small town of Houston, rangy and aggressive, already an ace with a growing reputation for unconventional tactics. He wanted permission to test whether the P-47 could be used as a ground attack aircraft, taking the fight directly to German troops and equipment on the ground. The idea seemed counterintuitive, even reckless. The Thunderbolt had been designed as a high-altitude fighter built to protect bombers at 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and the turbo-supercharger could work its magic. Taking it down to treetop level, where it would be vulnerable to every rifle, machine gun, and anti-aircraft position on the ground, where it would be unable to use its altitude advantages, appeared suicidal. Ground attack was a job for light bombers and attack aircraft, not expensive fighters with highly trained pilots. Duncan found 16 volunteers who shared his belief that the Jug could do more than escort bombers. He developed attack strategies, studying how best to approach ground targets, what angles to use for strafing runs, how to avoid the flak that would certainly reach up to meet them. Then they took their Thunderbolts down to ground level and tested their theories against live targets in German-occupied territory. One of Duncan's fellow pilots, Norman Benford, later recalled that Duncan was one of those colorful characters who inspire the rest of us to exceed our perceived limitations. Never expecting others to take risks he didn't take himself, Duncan led every mission from the front, demonstrating the techniques he'd developed and proving they could work. After 5 successful missions, Duncan's volunteers returned to their original units to teach what they'd learned. What they discovered would transform the air war over Europe and change the role of fighter aircraft forever. The Thunderbolt's size and weight, the very qualities that made it seem ungainly in a dogfight, made it devastatingly effective at ground attack. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine could absorb tremendous damage from ground fire and keep running. The air-cooled radial had no vulnerable coolant system to be punctured by a lucky rifle shot. Its self-sealing fuel tanks resisted fire even when hit by incendiary ammunition. Its armor protected the pilot from the small arms fire that brought down lighter, more agile fighters. And those 8 .50 caliber machine guns proved equally lethal against ground targets. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate thin-skinned vehicles, ignite fuel tanks, and shred infantry positions. A 2-second burst from a diving Thunderbolt could destroy a truck or kill the crew of an artillery piece. The effect was like driving a 5-ton truck straight at a wall at 60 mm. The Thunderbolt could also carry bombs. Early versions hung a 500-pound bomb beneath the belly. Later variants could carry a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that the pilots called Holy Moses because of their devastating impact. These rockets hit with the force of artillery shells. A flight of 4 P-47s could deliver more firepower than a battery of field artillery, and they could put it exactly where it was needed, when it was needed, with far greater accuracy than any gun on the ground. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the 9th Air Force had 13 fighter groups equipped with P-47D models tailored specifically for ground attack. They were the flying artillery of the Allied advance, and they were about to make the German Army's life a living hell. The 365th Fighter Group, known as the Hell Hawks, became one of the most effective ground attack units in the war. On D-Day, their pilots flew from bases in England to support the invasion, diving through clouds and anti-aircraft fire to attack German positions just inland from the beaches. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Stecker led the group, which was composed of 3 squadrons flying P-47D Thunderbolts loaded with bombs and ammunition. First Lieutenant John Fetzer, flying a Thunderbolt named the Madam after his wife Helen, remembered taking off in darkness from their English airfield and finding murky daylight over the channel. Their orders were simple and brutal: strafe or bomb anything German they found, half-tracks, tanks, or infantry. Over Omaha Beach, he looked down and saw vehicles and people everywhere, bodies lying all over the sand and in the surf. The scale of the invasion was beyond anything he'd imagined. The formation continued inland at near treetop level. Visible everywhere was the aftermath of the airborne assault that had kicked off the invasion hours earlier. Fetzer saw an American paratrooper dangling from a tree, head down, motionless. He saw gliders strewn across fields and hedgerows, some intact, others reduced to wreckage. He saw men scattered on the ground. The scene was horrible, a landscape of destruction and death that stretched as far as he could see. Then he saw German Tiger tanks moving toward the beaches. Captain Arlo Henry, the flight leader, was a stocky, laid-back pilot who smoked cigars on takeoff against regulations. He was also one of the boldest and most skilled fighter pilots in the group. Henry led the flight down to attack. If those panzers reached the beaches, if they got among the landing craft and the supplies being unloaded, the invasion could fail. Everything depended on stopping them. The Hellhawks destroyed the tanks. The invasion continued. By June 26th, just 3 weeks after D-Day, the 365th had moved to a forward airstrip at Azeville, France, continuing to fly ground attack missions in support of American troops fighting through the hedgerows. The pace was relentless. Pilots flew multiple missions per day, returning to rearm and refuel before taking off again to hit the next target. They ate their meals in cockpits, slept when they could, and flew until exhaustion made it dangerous to continue. For German soldiers on the ground, the transformation was immediate and horrifying. A tank destroyer soldier from an American unit near St. Lo later described watching an attack from his side. His unit was threatened by a German armored counterattack when they heard the distinctive sound of P-47 engines overhead. He wrote that they were getting scared and nervous when suddenly they heard those engines. They picked up radio transmissions from the pilots telling them to stand firm, that they saw the targets. There were 12 Thunderbolts in formation, and they began the deadliest strafing attack he ever saw in the war. The first plane went in strafing, and if the pilot saw a good target, he would release a 500-pound bomb. The second plane was coming right behind, then the third and fourth, and so on. By the time the 12th plane finished its run, the first one was starting over again. The attack seemed endless, a continuous rain of fire and explosives. The P-47 had plastered the whole area. The counterattack never materialized. The panzers that had threatened to push the Americans back into the sea were burning hulks scattered across the Norman countryside. German soldiers developed a grim joke to cope with the constant air attacks. They said they had a system for identifying airplanes overhead. If it was camouflaged, it was British. If it was silver, it was American. And if you couldn't see it at all, it was German. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies over France. German ground forces were left almost completely without air cover, exposed to attacks from above at any moment of any day. Death from the sky became so common that German soldiers coined a new term for it. They called it Jabo-Tod, death by fighter-bomber. It wasn't a small-caliber round, and the results were usually not pretty. Men were torn apart by 50-caliber bullets, incinerated by napalm, or crushed beneath the wreckage of vehicles destroyed around them. There was no warning, no time to react, no defense that could protect them. The casualty lists among German leadership in the first weeks of the Normandy campaign were staggering. Allied air and naval power killed or wounded multiple German generals in the first 2 weeks alone. General Erich Marx, commander of the LX Kriegsquartett 4th Corps, died on June the 12th when his vehicle was strafed by fighter bombers as he traveled to the front. General der Infanterie Heinz Hellmich of the 243rd Infantry Division was killed on June 17th by aircraft attack. General Major Rudolf Stegmann of the 77th Infantry Division died the following day in a similar attack. General der Infanterie Wilhelm Falli was killed by American paratroopers on D-Day itself when his staff car was ambushed. Brigade Führer Fritz Witt of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was killed on June 14th by Royal Navy gunfire at his command post. The psychological impact on German forces was devastating. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, later told his Allied captors that air attacks made it impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine in daylight. While that was an overstatement, it captured the desperation felt by German commanders who couldn't move men or equipment during daylight hours without inviting destruction from above. Every road became a potential killing ground. Every convoy became a target. July 29, 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, was underway. Near the village of Rancy, elements of the German army were trapped between the American 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions and had nowhere to run. The 405th Fighter Group found them. The Thunderbolts attacked the German column from 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 that evening. More than 6 hours of continuous assault. Wave after wave of P-47s dove on the trapped Germans, releasing bombs, firing rockets, strafing with 8 machine guns blazing. The Germans had no air cover, no effective anti-aircraft defense, no way to escape. They were caught in a killing ground from which there was no exit. When ground investigators examined the wreckage afterward, they found 66 tanks destroyed, 204 other vehicles wrecked, and 11 artillery pieces demolished. It was one of the most devastating single-day tallies of any fighter-bomber attack in the entire war. The roads were choked with burning metal and the bodies of men and horses. Worse was to come for the Germans. In August, Adolf Hitler ordered a counterattack at Mortain, throwing his remaining panzer divisions against the American lines in a desperate attempt to cut off the Allied breakout. The attack was codenamed Operation Lüttich, and for a few hours it seemed to threaten success. German tanks pushed forward, threatening to reach the sea and trap the American forces that had broken out from the Normandy beachhead. But the Allies had been forewarned by ultra-intelligence intercepts, and they had the Thunderbolts. When the skies cleared on August 7th, waves of P-47s descended on the German columns. The panzers concentrated for the attack became targets that the pilots couldn't miss. Within 24 hours, the threat of Operation Lüttich had been ended. The Germans had pushed forward only to find themselves trapped in an even worse position than before. Now, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves encircled near the town of Falaise. Between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a pocket that shrank daily under Allied ground and air attacks. The roads leading out of the pocket became killing grounds that the survivors would never forget. German soldiers called them the Corridor of Death. German accounts describe the area around Falaise as a Jabo-Rennstrecke, a fighter-bomber race course, because of the circling Thunderbolts always overhead. One German corporal later wrote that the Jabos were a burden on their souls. There was no escape from them, no moment of safety. Any movement drew fire from above. Men went mad from the constant attacks, from the knowledge that death could come at any second from the sky. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower visited the battlefield after it was secured. He later wrote that the battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, he was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could only be described by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Royal Air Force Liaison Officer Group Captain Desmond Scott noted that the roads were choked with wreckage and the swollen bodies of men and horses. Bits of uniform were plastered to shattered tanks and trucks, and human remains hung in grotesque shapes on the blackened hedgerows. The stench was overwhelming, carried for miles by the summer wind. The German army lost an estimated 60,000 men at Falaise, 10,000 dead, and 50,000 captured. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. The survivors fled east toward the Seine, but they left nearly all their heavy equipment behind. The German army in the west had been gutted. It would never recover. In September 1944, 9 squadrons of P-47s were dispatched to destroy a major German force threatening the right flank of the American army as it advanced across France. The air attacks were so devastating, so unrelenting, that the Germans surrendered purely as a result of the aerial assault, without significant ground combat. It was one of the few times in military history that an army surrendered to air power alone. The Thunderbolt had proven that tactical air power could be decisive, not through strategic bombing alone, but through tactical application at the point of contact. December 1944 brought the German Ardennes offensive, their last major counterattack in the West. Hitler had deliberately planned the assault for winter, believing that bad weather would ground Allied aircraft and allow his panzers to break through American lines. His generals protested that they lacked the resources for such an operation. Hitler overruled them. For the first few days, Hitler was right about the weather. Low clouds, snow, and fog kept the Thunderbolts on the ground, while German tanks poured through the Ardennes forest. American troops fell back in confusion, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. For a brief moment, it seemed the Germans might achieve a significant victory. Then the weather cleared. On December 23, 1944, American fighter bombers finally took to the skies. Major John Motzanicki led flights of P-47s along the winding roads near Hufvudstaden, searching for German activity among the snow-covered fields and dark green pine forests. What they found left them gaping in disbelief. A massive German column stretched for miles along the narrow roads. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, horse-drawn wagons, and thousands of soldiers crammed together in traffic jams created by the inadequate road network. The Thunderbolts attacked. By the time the day-long fight was over, Motzanicki's squadron and the rest of the Hellhawks had destroyed more than 115 German vehicles and artillery pieces, with another 65 wrecked or damaged. The roads became impassable, clogged with burning wrecks that blocked any movement forward or back. The German offensive stalled in the snow. First Lieutenant Leslie Bosse of the 365th Fighter Squadron had survived a gash in his skull from a canopy shattered by small arms fire over Brest. Near Saarbrücken, his P-47 took a direct hit from an 80 mm flak projectile that shredded his left wing root, fuselage, and flaps. By the end of the war, he would walk away from 4 wrecked Thunderbolts, all named Blonde Trouble. He flew 107 combat missions and was credited with 2 aerial victories. He later said the P-47 deserved greater recognition for its contribution to victory. The Germans tried one last desperate counterstroke. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack against Allied airfields using nearly 1,000 aircraft, the largest German air operation since the Battle of Britain. They caught many P-47s on the ground at their bases in France and Belgium and destroyed over 200 Allied aircraft, but the victory was hollow. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 300 aircraft of its own and hundreds of irreplaceable experienced pilots. American factories could replace destroyed Thunderbolts within weeks. Germany couldn't replace its losses. Bodenplatte marked the Luftwaffe's final significant offensive operation in the West. After the Battle of the Bulge, German resistance crumbled. The Thunderbolts ranged ahead of advancing Allied armies, destroying anything that moved on German roads and railways. The statistics from the final months of the European War are almost incomprehensible in their scale of destruction. From D-Day until victory, in Europe Day on May 8, 1945, P-47 pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks in nearly 550,000 combat sorties flown throughout the war. Thunderbolts destroyed approximately 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked as a flying barrel ended the war with an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. For every P-47 lost in combat, more than 4 enemy aircraft went down. And that ratio doesn't begin to account for the devastation wrought on ground targets. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolf Pack, was the only 8th Air Force unit that flew P-47s for the entire war. When other groups transitioned to the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang, the 56th refused. Their pilots loved the Jug and knew how to use it. By war's end, they'd claimed 607.5 aerial victories and 301 ground kills, more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force, at the cost of 128 aircraft lost. The Republic Aviation Corporation, which had nearly gone bankrupt before the war, became one of the most successful aircraft manufacturers in American history on the strength of the Thunderbolt. The company went on to produce jet fighters for the Cold War and contributed to some of the most advanced military aircraft ever built. But it was the P-47 that made Republic's reputation, that proved an immigrant engineer's vision, and a team of American workers could create something extraordinary. Francis Gabreski of the 56th scored 28 aerial victories before being shot down and captured in July 1944, making him the leading American ace in the European theater. Robert Johnson finished with 27. Hubert Zemke added nearly 18 before he too was shot down and captured. All flew Thunderbolts. Glenn Duncan, the Texan who pioneered ground attack tactics, was shot down on July 7, 1944, while leading a strafing mission against Wiesenfeld Airfield in Germany. His aircraft was hit by 88mm flak, and he belly-landed near Landsberg. Before leaving the wreck, he tossed an incendiary grenade into it to deny the Germans their prize. Then he escaped on foot, walking toward the Netherlands. He spent 10 months with the Dutch resistance before being liberated by Allied forces in April 1945. He returned to command the 303rd Fighter Group and retired from the United States Air Force as a colonel. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who designed the Thunderbolt, never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. He went on to design the F-84 Thunderjet and F-105 Thunderchief jet fighters and contributed to the design of the A-10 Thunderbolt 9. TOW, which still serves in the United States Air Force today and still bears his original aircraft's name. He died in 1974 at age 78, having shaped American air power for 3 decades. More than 15,600 P-47s were built during the war, more than any other American fighter. They served in every theater of operations, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea. Republic Aviation's factory on Long Island became one of the most productive aircraft plants in history, turning out aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible. Robert Johnson returned to the United States in June 1944 and spent the rest of the war on publicity tours selling war bonds. After the war, he joined Republic Aviation, where his first task was redesigning the P-47 cockpit based on his combat experience. He worked for the company for 18 years before moving into the insurance business. He traveled the country educating young people about World War II until his death in December 1998, at age 78. For the soldiers who faced the Thunderbolt from below, the experience left permanent scars. German veterans who served in Normandy often spoke of the Jabos with a mixture of fear and respect that bordered on trauma. Many developed an instinctive flinch at the sound of low-flying aircraft that lasted for the rest of their lives. The terror had become part of them. One German officer captured after the Normandy campaign was asked what he thought of American air power. His response was simple and devastating. He said that any movement in daylight was impossible, that supplies couldn't be brought forward, that even the simplest administrative functions had to be conducted at night or underground. The Americans had made his army blind, immobile, and helpless. But for American troops on the ground, the Thunderbolt was salvation. When German tanks were breaking through, when the situation seemed hopeless, the distinctive shape of the Jug appearing overhead meant help had arrived. Ground troops learned to love that big, ugly fighter because it protected them, because it destroyed the enemy that was trying to kill them. The bond between American infantry and American tactical air power was forged in Normandy and strengthened through every battle that followed. Major Josef Priller, the German ace who once derided the Thunderbolt as a joke, changed his assessment by war's end. He called it the perfect fighter-bomber. Its guns never jammed, never overheated. He said they laughed at the P-47 in 1943, but by 1945, nobody was laughing. The dinosaur had teeth, and those teeth tore the German army apart. Today, the legacy of the Thunderbolt lives on. The A-10 Thunderbolt Tatuano-Trenanfuit II, the famous warthog that provides close air support for American ground forces in conflicts around the world, was deliberately named to honor Kartveli's original creation. When Air Force officers were choosing a name for their new ground attack jet in the 1970s, they looked back at history and found the P-47. They recognized that the mission was the same, flying low and slow, supporting the troops on the ground, taking punishment that would destroy other aircraft, and coming back for more. Several P-47s have been preserved in museums around the world. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has a P-47D on display, its silver skin gleaming under the lights, exactly as it would have appeared over France in 1944. Other examples survive in private collections and in flying condition, appearing at air shows where a new generation can hear the distinctive roar of that massive Pratt & Whitney engine and understand, just for a moment, what it must have been like to see that shape descending from the sky. The pilots who flew the Thunderbolt formed lasting bonds that survived long after the war ended. The 56th Fighter Group Association held reunions for decades, bringing together men who'd shared the most intense experiences of their lives. The Hellhawks Association continued meeting until the last of its members passed away. These gatherings were not celebrations of war, but remembrances of sacrifice and service, of young men who climbed into their jugs every morning, knowing some of them wouldn't return. Historian Stephen Ambrose, who interviewed hundreds of World War II veterans for his books, noted that P-47 pilots had a distinctive pride in their aircraft that other fighter pilots didn't always share. They knew the Jug wasn't the most elegant aircraft in the sky, not the fastest, not the most agile, but they also knew it would bring them home when nothing else could. That trust, earned through countless missions and countless close calls, created a bond between pilot and machine that words struggle to capture. Tom Glenn, a P-47 pilot and later author, recalled that one of his saddest duties was strafing columns of horse-drawn guns and equipment. The horses weren't our enemy, he said, but our assignment was to prevent those columns from harming our troops. It was a reminder that even in victory, war demanded terrible choices from those who fought it. The lessons learned in those campaigns shaped military doctrine for generations. The integration of air and ground forces, the concept of tactical air power as flying artillery, the importance of air superiority not just for strategic bombing, but for every aspect of ground operations. All of these ideas were proven in the hedgerows and fields where the Thunderbolts hunted. Modern combined arms warfare owes a tremendous debt to the experiences of 1944 and 45. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to Tank Gunner Chronicles to stay connected with these histories. Each one matters. Each one shaped the world we live in today. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans continents, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.